Now we've got new MacBook Pros in 14-inch and 16-inch models, new chips inside. The real question is, are these new MacBook Pros Pro enough? There is a ton that is new about these new MacBook Pros, but it took us a long time to get here. What we've got now is a 14-inch MacBook Pro and a 16-inch MacBook Pro. We've had a 16-inch size for a couple of years now. That came up from the 15-inch size. Now we have a 14 that is basically replacing the traditional 13-inch MacBook Pro, although you can still get the more entry-level 13-inch MacBook Pro. And that takes us back to last year when Apple first introduced the M1 chips in a bunch of Macs. They did the 13-inch MacBook Air, they did the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and they did the Mac Mini. Now the problem was the chip in these systems was so similar. There were a couple of tiny differences. The Pro N had 8 GPU cores versus 7 for the base Air, but other than that they were the same. Whether you were buying a Mac Mini for $700, a MacBook Air for $999, or a MacBook Pro for $1299, and there was not a ton of performance difference between them. It was kind of hard to justify getting that 13-inch MacBook Pro when the $999 Air was great and frankly had the fingerprint reader that they took out of the touch bar, and it also gave you regular function keys instead of, again, that touch bar, which has been in MacBook Pros for many years now. Well, that's one thing you're not going to see in the new 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros without a lot of fanfare. That has been removed. And frankly, a lot of people have said if Apple loses the touch bar, nobody's going to mind. And I think that's probably true. There were a couple of good things about it. I always liked adjusting my volume and brightness, just using a sliding scale to do that rather than pressing the brightness up and down and the volume up and down buttons. And of course, the fingerprint reader was fantastic, but Apple has now broken that out, and on things like the MacBook Air and the new 24-inch iMac keyboards, you just get the fingerprint reader. You don't have to deal with the rest of the touch bar. So I don't think anyone is going to shed a tear for the end of the touch bar era. But if you really do miss the touch bar, you can still get that 13-inch MacBook Pro that has the touch bar. It's a bit of a throwback, frankly feels much less pro than these new models. Also, interestingly, looking at the specs on paper, the 14-inch MacBook Pro weighs a full half pound more than the 13-inch. It's not a lot, but it's not peanuts either. When you talk about Mac updates, sometimes you're talking about external updates and sometimes you're talking about internal updates. Some years the internal updates are so extensive you basically have a brand new machine on the inside but no change on the outside. That frankly was the case for many, many years with a lot of Apple products. This case, with the new 14-inch Pro and 16-inch Pro, you have internal changes and you have external changes. For regular mainstream consumer types like you and I, frankly, those external changes are what you're going to see first and maybe more practical and more important to you. I think the number one thing is Apple is adding back some of the ports that we've lost over the years. Now, MacBooks used to have an HDMI port, although before that they didn't have an HDMI port and we thought they would never add it, and I would write stories saying it would be great if Apple added this, and they did, and then they took it out again. Well, now it's back again. The same thing about the SD card slot, and I've been using SD cards a lot more lately just because the Nintendo Switch uses them and some of the 3D printers I test use them. So suddenly I'm up to my elbows in SD cards and micro SD cards. So nice to have that reader back there. And of course, you get a MagSafe power connection, which again is something that the MacBooks used to have, then took away, and now they're adding back. It's almost as if Apple is doing kind of a greatest hits run down memory lane and cherry picking the things that people like the most about previous Macs and cramming them all into these new systems. Now, I have said a couple of times that bringing back MagSafe has advantages but also has disadvantages, and some people have said I'm just being too cranky about it, but I'll tell you why. Because having USB-C as the main charging port on your MacBook makes it so universal, because you can use the same charger on your MacBook Air, on your 13-inch MacBook Pro, I think on your iPad Pro, on your Nintendo Switch, on just about any Dell XPS 13 or Lenovo Yoga laptop you're likely to run into. Anything short of a gaming laptop these days basically has that universal USB-C power connection. So when somebody is in a coffee shop or an office or anywhere and goes, does anybody have a MacBook cable? You know they're talking about a USB-C cable, and you can use an Apple one, you can use another branded one. It's pretty universal and pretty interchangeable. With the new MacBook Pros, you can still charge through USB-C, but now you've got MagSafe as well. So when somebody says, hey, can I borrow your cable? Maybe they have a USB-C one, maybe they have a MagSafe one. It's just not going to be as universal. It's not the end of the world, but I like non-proprietary connections versus proprietary ones, all things being equal. Another thing you're going to notice, the screens take up more of that top panel, so thinner bezels. In fact, now they have the notch cut out for the webcam, whereas before it was just, built into the top of the lid. The notch, of course, we've seen it before on the iPhone. Now it's coming to the MacBook, but it does not add Face ID, which you might think if you saw it. However, it's gone up from a 720 resolution camera to a 1080, which frankly is probably the single most important thing here. We spent a lot of our time in web meetings and Zoom meetings and other kinds of video conferences, and MacBook webcams generally look terrible. Most laptop webcams look terrible. A few of them have moved up to 1080 cameras like the Surface Pro. Some Mac devices have 1080 webcams like the 24-inch and 27-inch iMac, and using them compared to the regular MacBook cameras, it's a huge difference. So the 1080 camera is going to be one of your favorite features about these new products. And of course, that's coupled with the mini LED screen, which is the same screen technology that's in that really awesome iPad Pro. MacBook screens before this did not look terrible, but they're going to look even better now. Inside, that's where they're really selling the Pro part of the MacBook Pro. You've got new versions of the M1 chip. They didn't call it the M2, they didn't call it the M1X, it's the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. Now the Max is higher than the Pro, and the Pro is higher than the regular M1. For a lot of people, the main difference is going to be the number of graphics cores available, basically how much it can do in terms of graphics processing, what you would usually have a discrete GPU for, something from NVIDIA or something from AMD, and previous iMacs and MacBook Pros and Mac Pros had a variety of AMD discrete graphics options. Now it's all bundled in with the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. It's hard to compare them apples to apples until we actually get some of these and run some tests on them, but generally the M1 Pro has 16 graphics cores, the M1 Max has 32, the regular M1 has either 7 or 8 graphics cores, depending on which specific model of laptop you get. And that is really what has kept a lot of the really pro users, people who do a lot of high-end Photoshop and video editing and 3D model creation and game programming. That's kept them away from the original M1 MacBook Pro from last year because it just didn't have the graphics horsepower they needed. And some people felt, Apple was not taking care of that audience yet. So this is the attempt to take care of that audience and to get people who would easily spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 on a system to feel like they can buy one of these new MacBook Pros and they can use it professionally. Now, are these going to make MacBook Pros into gaming machines? Probably not. Apple literally did not mention gaming once, I think, in their MacBook Pro presentation they just did. I'm talking to a couple of game developers and game publishers about whether they feel the new graphics power built into these Pros will help them move more into Mac gaming, but it remains a pretty dead platform for gaming. Over the past year, since we first started using M1 Max, the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, the Mac Mini, the initial concern was that there was going to be issues with software compatibility, software emulation, things not working right. I found that using an Air and a Pro almost daily for just about a year now, the switchover was actually very, very transparent, which is really the best thing that you can say to someone in a situation like this. You don't want to really notice the new operating system. You don't want to really notice the new CPU. You just want it to work. So I had no problem doing Photoshop, Premiere, all kinds of stuff on regular M1 systems, and I'm sure the same thing is going to be true of the M1 Pro and the M1 Max systems, which again, I have not seen or used in person yet. There are a handful of programs that audience really needs and needs to work well. A lot of the Adobe stuff, some of Apple's own stuff like Logic Pro and like Final Cut, some 3D programs. Once you get those nailed down, I think the Pro audience is going to come along. Apple, of course, also pushes the idea that the M1 series is very power efficient. The M1 Air and Pro had very good battery life. Apple is promising 21 hours on the 16-inch, I think 17 hours on the 14-inch. That compares to about 20 hours they promised on the 13-inch M1 Pro from last year. Obviously, an hour everyday use, it doesn't run quite that long. I think about 10, 11, 12 hours usually, depending on what you're doing. But that's still a lot more than they were even a couple of years ago. And the 16-inch is going to be able to run longer just because it's a bigger body and has room for a bigger battery. The new MacBook Pro models are available to pre-order now. They're going to start shipping October 26th. The 14-inch starts at $1999. The 16-inch starts at $2499.